May 8, 1945, Czechoslovakia, near the German-Soviet demarcation line. Major Erich Hartmann, the highest-scoring fighter ace in aviation history, with 352 confirmed aerial victories, stood beside his Messerschmitt Bf 109 G-14 fighter aircraft, knowing this would be his final flight as a free man. The war was ending. Germany had surrendered. Soviet forces were advancing from the east, while American forces held positions to the west. Hartmann faced a critical decision: surrender to the Americans or surrender to the Soviets. He knew that Soviet captivity would be harsh because he had spent the entire war shooting down Soviet aircraft over the Eastern Front, and because Soviet propaganda had portrayed him as a war criminal, calling him the Black Devil of the South for the distinctive black tulip marking painted on the nose of his aircraft. Hartmann had shot down more enemy aircraft than any other pilot in history. His 352 confirmed victories exceeded the totals of any American, British, Soviet, or other German pilot. He had achieved these victories over the span of approximately 1,400 combat sorties flown between 1942 and 1945, averaging 1 kill for every 4 missions. He had been shot down or forced to crash land 16 times during his career, but had never been shot down by enemy fighters. All his forced landings resulted from mechanical failures or from ground fire. He had never lost a wingman in combat, a remarkable achievement that demonstrated his skill not just in destroying enemies, but in protecting the pilots flying with him. Now, at age 23, Hartmann's war was ending, but his ordeal was just beginning. Erich Alfred Hartmann was born on April 19, 1922, in Weissach, Germany. His mother, Elisabeth, was an early aviation enthusiast who learned to fly and who ran a gliding school, introducing Erich to aviation at an early age. He soloed in a glider at age 14 and earned his glider pilot's license at 15. His early experience with gliding taught him fundamentals of aerodynamics and aircraft handling that would prove invaluable in his later career as a fighter pilot. The unpowered nature of gliding required precise understanding of energy management, how to convert altitude into distance, how to find and exploit rising air currents, how to judge landing approaches perfectly because there was no opportunity for a go-around. These skills translated directly to combat flying, where managing energy and making perfect decisions about when to engage and when to break off were critical to survival and success. Hartmann joined the Luftwaffe in 1940 at age 18. He completed flight training and was assigned to fighter pilot training, qualifying on the Messerschmitt Bf 109, the Luftwaffe's primary single-seat fighter. His training was thorough, but by 1942, when he completed the program, Germany was engaged in total war on multiple fronts, and the Luftwaffe was suffering increasing losses. New pilots were being rushed to operational units with less training than peacetime standards would have required. Hartmann was fortunate that his gliding experience gave him flying skills that compensated for the abbreviated training. He was assigned to Jagdgeschwader 52, JG 52, a fighter wing operating on the Eastern Front against Soviet forces. JG 52 would become the highest-scoring fighter unit in aviation history, and Hartmann would become its highest-scoring pilot. Hartmann arrived at JG 52 in October 1942 and flew his first combat mission on November 5, 1942. The mission was uneventful, and Hartmann did not encounter enemy aircraft. His early missions were similarly quiet, as he learned the realities of combat flying under the guidance of experienced pilots. His first aerial victory came on November 5, 1942, when he shot down an Ilyushin Il-2 Sturmovik ground attack aircraft. The victory was significant because the Il-2 was heavily armored and difficult to destroy, but it was also an easy target compared to enemy fighters because it was slow and not particularly maneuverable. Hartmann's early career was marked by caution and by learning from more experienced pilots. His tactical development was influenced particularly by his squadron commander and by other aces in the unit who mentored him. The lessons he learned emphasized several principles that would define his approach throughout his career. Never engage unless you have significant advantage in position or altitude. Always attack from surprise if possible. Get close before shooting to ensure hits. Break off after the attack rather than staying in a turning fight. Protect your wingman and stay in formation. These principles, which Hartmann summarized as see, decide, attack, break, became his tactical doctrine and were key to his survival and success. The see phase involved spotting enemy aircraft before they spotted you, which required constant vigilance and excellent eyesight. Hartmann's vision was exceptional, and he trained himself to scan systematically, looking for the tiny dots against sky or ground that might be enemy aircraft. The decide phase involved assessing whether to attack based on tactical situation. Did he have altitude advantage? Was he positioned for surprise attack? Were enemy fighters nearby that might interfere? Was his fuel state adequate for engagement? Hartmann was disciplined about refusing to engage when conditions were not favorable, a discipline that many pilots lacked and that contributed to their deaths. The attack phase involved getting as close as possible before opening fire, often closing to within 50 meters or less before shooting. This close range ensured that hits would be lethal and minimized ammunition expenditure. It required nerves of steel to close so tightly because the risk of collision or of being hit by debris from the exploding enemy aircraft was significant. The break phase involved immediately disengaging after the attack, diving away or using superior speed to separate before enemy fighters could respond. Hartmann never stayed in turning dogfights where numbers could overwhelm individual skill. He attacked, killed, and left before enemy pilots could effectively respond. This tactical approach was conservative and focused on survival as much as on achieving kills. Many pilots were more aggressive, staying in fights longer and taking greater risks. Those pilots often achieved rapid increases in victory totals, but also often died young. Hartmann's approach kept him alive and allowed him to accumulate victories consistently over 3 years of continuous combat. Hartmann's victory total grew steadily through 1943. By the end of that year, he had achieved approximately 150 victories, making him one of the Luftwaffe's top-scoring aces. His success earned him rapid promotions and awards. He received the Knight's Cross in October 1943 after achieving his 148th victory, a decoration that recognized exceptional bravery and success in combat. He would eventually receive higher grades of the Knight's Cross, including the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, swords, and diamonds, the second highest military decoration Germany awarded. Only 27 people received this decoration during the entire war, reflecting the exceptional nature of Hartmann's achievements. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 that Hartmann flew was one of history's most successful fighter aircraft designs. The 109 was fast, maneuverable, and heavily armed with cannon and machine guns. It could outperform most Soviet fighters in 1943-44 in terms of speed and climb rate, giving skilled pilots like Hartmann significant advantages. But the 109 also had limitations, including limited fuel capacity requiring careful management, difficult ground handling characteristics that made takeoffs and landings dangerous, and a cramped cockpit that became uncomfortable during long missions. Hartmann learned to exploit the 109's strengths while managing its limitations. He flew the aircraft to its limits, but never beyond them, understanding exactly how much performance he could extract while maintaining safety margins. The distinctive black tulip painted on the nose of Hartmann's aircraft became his personal marking and contributed to his reputation among Soviet pilots. The black tulip was initially painted as camouflage to make it harder for enemy pilots to judge distance and closure rate during head-on attacks. But it became recognizable, and Soviet pilots learned to identify and avoid the aircraft with the black tulip, knowing that engaging that particular 109 was likely to be fatal. Soviet propaganda portrayed Hartmann as a war criminal and branded him the Black Devil of the South, using his success and his distinctive aircraft marking to create a bogeyman figure meant to motivate Soviet pilots and to deflect from the Luftwaffe's air superiority over the Eastern Front during much of the war. The propaganda had unintended consequence of making Hartmann even more cautious because he knew Soviet pilots were specifically trying to kill him and were more alert when he was in the area. Hartmann's typical combat day during 1943-44 involved multiple sorties. He would fly as many as 4 or 5 missions per day during periods of intense operations, landing to refuel and rearm between missions. Each mission lasted typically 1 to 2 hours depending on fuel consumption and tactical situation. Most missions involved patrol over German ground forces, escorting German bombers, or responding to reports of enemy aircraft in specific areas. Many missions resulted in no contact with enemy aircraft because the Eastern Front was vast and aircraft densities were relatively low, despite the huge numbers involved overall. But when contact occurred, it often involved large numbers of aircraft on both sides, creating chaotic battles where dozens of aircraft might be engaged simultaneously. Hartmann's discipline about engaging only when he had advantage meant that even in these large battles, he would often make 1 or 2 quick attacks and then disengage rather than staying in the fight until his fuel was exhausted or until he was surrounded by enemy fighters. The physical demands of combat flying were severe. Flying a high-performance fighter required constant physical effort. The controls were heavy and required strength to maneuver aggressively. Combat maneuvering subjected pilots to high G-forces that could cause blackouts if sustained too long. Maintaining vigilance for hours while scanning for enemies was mentally exhausting. The stress of combat, knowing that any mistake could result in death, took psychological toll that accumulated over hundreds of missions. Hartmann managed these demands through excellent physical conditioning, through rest when possible, and through mental discipline that allowed him to stay focused and calm even in the most chaotic situations. The progression of Hartmann's victory total through 1944 was remarkable. By summer 1944, he had exceeded 250 victories. By autumn, he had passed 300, a total that no other pilot in history had achieved. Each milestone was celebrated within JG-52 and was publicized in German media as propaganda showcasing Luftwaffe superiority, despite Germany's deteriorating strategic situation. Hartmann himself was ambivalent about the publicity. He was proud of his achievements and of serving Germany, but he was uncomfortable with being portrayed as superhuman when he knew that his success resulted from sound tactics, good training, excellent aircraft, and fortunate circumstances as much as from individual skill. The final months of the war saw Hartmann's victory total climb to its final count of 352. His 352nd and final victory occurred on May 8, 1945, the day Germany surrendered. The victory was against a Soviet Yak-9 fighter, the same type of aircraft that constituted many of his victories throughout the war. After scoring the kill, Hartmann returned to his airfield and learned that Germany had surrendered. He destroyed his aircraft to prevent it from being captured by Soviet forces and began preparing for the uncertain future. The decision about whether to surrender to Americans or Soviets was critical. Hartmann knew that many German soldiers who surrendered to Soviets were not released for years and were subjected to harsh treatment in Soviet captivity. He hoped that surrendering to Americans might allow him to return home more quickly. But geographical realities complicated the situation. His unit was positioned where Soviet forces would arrive first. Attempting to reach American lines would require traveling through areas controlled by Soviet forces or by Czech partisans who were hostile to Germans. Hartmann and his unit decided to attempt to reach American lines. They began moving west, trying to stay ahead of advancing Soviet forces. But on May 8th, they encountered Soviet troops and were captured. Hartmann's war as a combatant ended, but his ordeal as a prisoner was beginning. Soviet interrogators quickly identified Hartmann as a high-value prisoner because of his status as the Luftwaffe's highest-scoring ace. They accused him of war crimes, including deliberately targeting civilians and executing Soviet pilots who had bailed out. These accusations were false. Hartmann had fought according to established rules of warfare and had never deliberately attacked civilians or killed prisoners. But Soviet authorities were determined to extract confessions that could be used for propaganda purposes and to justify harsh treatment of German prisoners. Hartmann refused to confess to crimes he had not committed. His refusal resulted in particularly harsh treatment during interrogation. He was subjected to solitary confinement, inadequate food, and psychological pressure designed to break his will. Soviet interrogators told him that if he confessed and if he agreed to cooperate with Soviet authorities, he would be released and would be allowed to return to Germany. If he continued refusing, he would remain in Soviet custody indefinitely. Hartmann refused all offers. He maintained that he had been a soldier fighting for his country, that he had followed the rules of warfare, and that he had committed no crimes. His refusal demonstrated the same discipline and determination that had characterized his combat career. He would not compromise his principles regardless of consequences. The conditions in Soviet captivity were brutal. Hartmann was held in various prisons and labor camps in the Soviet Union from 1945 to 1955, a period of 10 years. Conditions varied, but were generally characterized by inadequate food, harsh physical labor, minimal medical care, and systematic psychological abuse designed to break prisoners' spirits and extract cooperation. Many German prisoners died in Soviet captivity from starvation, disease, or overwork. Hartmann survived through physical resilience, through mental toughness, and through support from fellow prisoners who shared resources and provided mutual encouragement. The specific charges against Hartmann evolved over time as Soviet authorities attempted to find something that would justify continued imprisonment. He was accused of destroying Soviet aircraft, which was obviously true, but was not a crime since he had been a combatant in warfare. He was accused of killing Soviet pilots, which was also true, but also not criminal. He was accused of various atrocities, including bombing civilians and executing prisoners, accusations that were false, but that Soviet authorities hoped he would confess to. In 1949, Hartmann was sentenced by a Soviet military tribunal to 25 years hard labor for war crimes. The sentence was based on fabricated evidence and coerced testimony from other prisoners. Hartmann continued to maintain his innocence. He refused to participate in Soviet propaganda efforts that would have required him to denounce Germany or to claim that he had committed crimes. His refusal resulted in him being classified as an unrepentant fascist who warranted particularly harsh treatment. The psychological warfare directed at Hartmann included attempts to recruit him to serve in East German military forces. Soviet authorities and East German communist officials offered to release him immediately and to give him a senior position in the East German Air Force if he would agree to serve the communist regime. Hartmann refused these offers as well. He would not betray West Germany or his principles regardless of what was offered. His refusal frustrated Soviet and East German authorities who saw Hartmann as a valuable propaganda asset whose cooperation could legitimize the East German regime and could demonstrate that even committed anti-communists could be converted. The conditions of Hartmann's imprisonment varied depending on which camp he was held in and depending on how Soviet authorities viewed his attitude at any given time. When he was deemed cooperative, or when authorities hoped to extract cooperation through better treatment, conditions improved marginally. When he was deemed uncooperative or when authorities wanted to punish him, conditions worsened. He spent periods in solitary confinement, periods working in mines or in other hard labor, periods in transit between different camps. Throughout, he maintained contact when possible with other German prisoners, particularly with other pilots and military officers who shared his determination to resist Soviet pressure and to maintain dignity despite circumstances. The diplomatic situation regarding German prisoners in Soviet custody was complex and evolved slowly. After World War II ended, most German prisoners held by Western allies were released relatively quickly, usually within a few years. But Soviet Union continued holding hundreds of thousands of German prisoners for years, using them as forced labor and using them as bargaining chips in negotiations with Germany and with Western powers. The establishment of West Germany as a separate state in 1949 and East Germany as a Soviet puppet state complicated the situation because Soviet Union claimed that German prisoners should be returned to East Germany rather than to West Germany. Many prisoners, including Hartmann, refused to accept this and insisted on being returned to West Germany. The deadlock continued for years. The breakthrough came in the mid-1950s as part of broader thaw in Cold War tensions following Stalin's death in 1953. West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer negotiated with Soviet leadership for the release of remaining German prisoners. The negotiations resulted in agreement that prisoners would be released and would be allowed to choose whether to go to East or West Germany. Between 1953 and 1956, most remaining German prisoners were released. Hartmann was released in October 1955 after 10 years in Soviet captivity. He was 33 years old, had lost 10 years of his life, and returned to a Germany that had been divided and transformed in ways he could barely recognize. Hartmann's return to West Germany was emotional and complicated. He was reunited with his wife Ursula, whom he had married in 1944 and whom he had not seen since his capture in 1945. She had waited for him throughout his captivity, refusing to believe Soviet claims that he was dead and maintaining faith that he would eventually return. Their reunion was joyful, but also difficult, because 10 years of separation and because the trauma of Hartmann's captivity created barriers that required time and effort to overcome. Hartmann's physical condition when released was poor. He had lost significant weight, suffered from various health problems resulting from inadequate nutrition and from hard labor, and bore psychological scars from 10 years of harsh treatment and from isolation from everything he had known. He required months of recovery to regain health and to begin adapting to life in peacetime West Germany. The adjustment to civilian life was difficult. Hartmann had been a soldier from age 18 to 23, and then had been a prisoner from age 23 to 33. He had no civilian work experience, no education beyond military training, and no clear idea of what he wanted to do with his life beyond flying, which was the only thing he had ever been truly passionate about. The opportunity to continue flying came through the establishment of the new West German Air Force, Bundesluftwaffe, in 1956, as West Germany was rearmed as part of NATO. Hartmann was invited to join the new Air Force and was offered a senior position based on his experience and his status as Germany's most successful pilot. He accepted and began the second phase of his military career, this time flying jets and serving a democratic West Germany aligned with NATO rather than serving Nazi Germany. Hartmann's service in the Bundesluftwaffe from 1956 to 1970 was successful, but also frustrating. He commanded fighter wings, trained new pilots, and contributed significantly to establishing the professional culture and tactical doctrine of the new Air Force. He transitioned to jet aircraft, including American-supplied F-86 Sabres and later German F-104 Starfighters. He adapted successfully to jet performance characteristics that were vastly different from the piston-engine aircraft he had flown during World War II. But he also encountered difficulties related to his uncompromising personality and his outspoken criticism of decisions he believed were wrong. Hartmann was highly critical of the decision to procure the F-104 Starfighter as the Bundesluftwaffe's primary fighter aircraft. He believed the aircraft was unsuitable for the missions the Bundesluftwaffe needed to perform, and predicted that it would have high accident rates. His predictions proved accurate, as the F-104 did indeed have a terrible safety record in German service, killing numerous pilots in accidents. But his public criticism of decisions that had been made by senior leadership and by political authorities created tensions that made his position uncomfortable. He also found that his combat experience and his tactical philosophy were sometimes at odds with NATO doctrine and with the more bureaucratic and committee-driven approach to military planning that characterized peacetime military service. The independent decision-making and individual initiative that had characterized his World War II experience were less valued in an institutional military culture that emphasized standardization and following procedures. Hartmann retired from the Bundesluftwaffe in 1970 at age 48. His retirement was earlier than it might have been if not for tensions resulting from his criticism of the F-104 and from his difficulties adapting to peacetime military culture. He spent his retirement years in Germany, working occasionally as an aviation consultant, attending reunions of JG-52 veterans, and giving interviews about his experiences. He became one of the most famous living pilots and was respected internationally as the greatest fighter ace in history. His record of 352 victories remains unmatched and almost certainly will never be matched because modern air combat is fundamentally different from World War II. To combat in ways that make accumulating such totals impossible. Hartmann's relationship with his World War II service and with his victory total was complex. He was proud of having been an excellent pilot and of having served his country. He believed he had fought honorably and according to the rules of warfare. He did not apologize for having fought for Germany, even though Germany had been led by a criminal regime, arguing that soldiers fight for their countries and their comrades rather than for political leaders, and that holding individual soldiers responsible for their government's crimes is unjust unless those soldiers personally participated in criminal acts. This position was controversial because it seemed to minimize German responsibility for Nazi crimes, and because it suggested that fighting for Nazi Germany was morally equivalent to fighting for the Allies. Critics argued that German soldiers bore some responsibility for enabling Nazi Germany, even if they did not personally commit atrocities. Defenders argued that conscripted soldiers had little choice about whether to serve, and that expecting them to refuse service or to desert was unrealistic given the consequences for themselves and their families. The debate reflected broader post-war German struggles with historical responsibility and with how to honor military service, while acknowledging that the cause being served was unjust. Hartmann's tactical legacy influenced fighter pilot training and doctrine in multiple air forces. His see-decide attack-break methodology was studied and adapted. His emphasis on patience, discipline, and refusing to engage unless holding advantage became standard teaching in fighter pilot training. His practice of getting very close before firing to ensure hits influenced gunnery training. His record of never losing a wingman illustrated the importance of mutual support and teamwork even for the most skilled individual pilots. Modern fighter pilots study Hartmann's combat tactics as examples of sound decision-making and effective use of aircraft capabilities. The question of how Hartmann achieved such an extraordinarily high victory total compared to pilots in other air forces is complex and involves multiple factors. First, Hartmann flew on the Eastern Front, where he faced large numbers of Soviet aircraft flown by pilots whose average skill level was lower than German pilots' average skill level, at least during the early to mid-war period. Soviet pilots improved significantly as the war progressed, but the skill gap gave German pilots, including Hartmann, significant advantages. Second, Hartmann flew almost continuously for 3 years, with only brief interruptions for leave or training, accumulating approximately 1 to 400 combat sorties. Most Allied pilots flew combat tours of limited duration before being rotated to training or rear area assignments, limiting their opportunity to accumulate victories. Third, Hartmann's exceptional eyesight, his excellent tactical judgment, his superior aircraft, at least through 1944, and his discipline about engaging only when holding advantage all contributed to his success. Fourth, the Luftwaffe's victory confirmation standards were rigorous and required multiple witnesses or physical evidence, meaning that Hartmann's 352 confirmed victories represent only those kills that could be definitively proven. He probably shot down additional aircraft that were not confirmed. The combination of these factors created circumstances where a pilot with Hartmann's skills and dedication could achieve totals that would be impossible in other contexts. The comparison between Hartmann's victory total and those of top Allied aces illustrates these differences. The highest-scoring American ace was Richard Bong with 40 victories. The highest-scoring British ace was Marmaduke Patel with approximately 50 victories, exact count disputed. The highest-scoring Soviet ace was Ivan Kozhedub with 64 victories. All of these pilots were exceptionally skilled and brave, but none came close to Hartmann's total because they operated under different circumstances with different opportunities. The controversy surrounding Hartmann's service for Nazi Germany and the question of whether his achievements should be celebrated or condemned reflects broader debates about how to remember World War II and how to assess individual actions within systems that commit terrible crimes. Hartmann did not participate directly in the Holocaust or in Nazi atrocities. He fought in air combat against military targets, but he fought for a regime that was committing genocide and aggressive war. Does his individual honor as a fighter pilot outweigh his service to a criminal regime? Or should his achievements be acknowledged while also acknowledging the context in which they occurred? There are no simple answers. Some argue that Hartmann and other German soldiers should be honored for their courage and skill, while clearly distinguishing between honoring individuals and honoring the cause they served. Others argue that anyone who served Nazi Germany bears some responsibility for enabling Nazi crimes regardless of their individual actions. The debate continues, and likely will continue, because it involves fundamental questions about responsibility, duty, and how societies should remember complex histories. Hartmann's 10 years in Soviet captivity were largely ignored in Soviet and later Russian historiography because acknowledging that the highest-scoring ace survived the war and spent a decade in Soviet prisons would undermine Soviet propaganda about having defeated the Luftwaffe and would raise uncomfortable questions about Soviet treatment of prisoners. Soviet accounts of the air war on the Eastern Front generally minimized German achievements and inflated Soviet success. Acknowledging Hartmann's 352 victories would contradict these narratives. The treatment of German prisoners by Soviet authorities after World War II remains a controversial topic in Russia, where Soviet actions during and after the war are generally portrayed heroically, and where acknowledging harsh treatment of prisoners or other problematic actions is politically sensitive. The post-Cold War period saw some re-examination of these issues, but official Russian narratives still largely defend Soviet actions. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 that Hartmann flew achieved legendary status because of his success flying it. The 109 was produced in larger numbers than any other fighter aircraft in history, with over 33,000 built. It served throughout World War II and in various air forces for years afterward. Hartmann's success demonstrated what skilled pilot could achieve flying the 109 and contributed to the aircraft's reputation as one of history's greatest fighter designs. Several of Hartmann's personal 109s survive in museums, preserved as historical artifacts representing the highest level of achievement in piston-engine fighter combat. The reunions of JG-52 veterans that occurred regularly after the war provided opportunities for Hartmann and his former comrades to maintain friendships and to share memories. These reunions were important for the men who had shared extraordinary experiences that civilians could not fully understand. The reunions also served as informal historical documentation, as veterans recorded their memories and shared perspectives on battles and events. Hartmann's presence at these reunions was valued because of his status, but also because he genuinely cared about his former comrades and maintained humility despite his fame. He credited his success to the support of his wingmen, to his squadron mates who covered him, and to the ground crews who maintained his aircraft, deflecting personal credit and acknowledging that individual achievement in combat resulted from team effort. The documentary films and books about Hartmann produced over decades since the war have portrayed him variously as hero, as skilled technician, as victim of Soviet injustice, and as controversial figure whose achievements must be considered in context of fighting for Nazi Germany. Each portrayal reflects the creator's perspective and the era's attitudes toward World War II and toward German military history. Early post-war portrayals emphasized his skill and his suffering in Soviet captivity, presenting him sympathetically. Later portrayals have been more critical, questioning his lack of public remorse for having served Nazi Germany and examining the human cost of his 352 victories in terms of Soviet pilots killed. The most balanced portrayals acknowledge both his extraordinary abilities and his problematic service to a criminal regime, holding both truths without resolving the tension between them. Hartmann's death in 1993, at age 71, came after a period of declining health related to his wartime experiences and his decade in Soviet captivity. His funeral was attended by hundreds, including many former Luftwaffe pilots, Bundesluftwaffe colleagues, and aviation enthusiasts. Obituaries acknowledged his status as the greatest fighter ace in history, while noting the controversies surrounding his service and his legacy. His widow Ursula survived him by many years, dedicating herself to preserving his memory and defending his reputation against critics who portrayed him as war criminal or as Nazi sympathizer. She argued until her own death that he had been a patriotic German who had served honorably and who had been unjustly imprisoned by Soviets for a decade because of his success in combat. The historical assessment of Hartmann's career and significance continues to evolve as historians gain access to new sources and as perspectives on World War II change with generational distance from the events. Recent scholarship has examined Hartmann's career more critically, questioning some aspects of German victory claims and analyzing the context in which such high totals were possible. This scholarship does not diminish Hartmann's achievements, but contextualizes them within the broader history of the air war and within understanding of how victory totals were calculated and confirmed. The technological evolution from the piston engine fighters Hartmann flew to modern jet fighters has made direct comparisons between World War II aces and modern fighter pilots difficult. Modern air combat involves beyond visual range missiles, sophisticated radar systems, and network-centric warfare, where individual pilots are nodes in larger systems rather than independent hunters. The ace culture that characterized World War II, where individual pilots accumulated personal victory totals and achieved fame, has largely disappeared. Modern air forces emphasize team performance over individual achievement. This shift reflects changed technology, but also reflects changed military culture that de-emphasizes hero worship in favor of recognizing that modern warfare requires complex coordination that cannot be attributed to individuals. Hartmann represented the end of an era where individual skill and courage could determine combat outcomes, where pilots engaged in visual range dogfights where the better pilot usually won, and where personal achievement was measured in enemy aircraft destroyed. That era ended with World War II. The lessons from Hartmann's career that remain relevant include the importance of tactical discipline, the value of patience over aggression, the necessity of knowing your aircraft's capabilities and limitations, and the recognition that survival matters as much as victory, because dead pilots cannot continue fighting regardless of how brave or skilled they were. These lessons apply to any competitive or dangerous endeavor where success requires balancing risk against reward. and where long-term performance matters more than short-term glory. Hartmann's 352 victories represent approximately 0.5% of total German air victories during World War II, which exceeded 70,000. But the symbolic importance of his achievement exceeded its numerical contribution because it demonstrated the highest level of individual performance possible and because it showed what dedicated individual could accomplish even in a losing cause. Germany lost the air war and lost World War II, but Hartmann's personal victory demonstrated that individual excellence could persist even in strategic defeat. The comparison between Hartmann's career flying for Nazi Germany and his post-war career flying for democratic West Germany illustrates how military professionalism can persist across radically different political systems. Hartmann remained a skilled and dedicated pilot, regardless of which government he served. This raised questions about whether military professionals serve their nations or serve their governments, and whether it is possible or desirable to separate military service from political context. Hartmann believed that soldiers serve their countries and that political leaders come and go, but national identity and loyalty persist. This belief allowed him to serve first Nazi Germany and then democratic West Germany with equal dedication. Critics argued that this position ignored the moral differences between the two regimes and implied that all service is equivalent regardless of what cause is being served. The memoirs Hartmann published and the interviews he gave over the years provided detailed accounts of his combat experiences, his time in Soviet captivity, and his reflections on his career. These first-person accounts are valuable historical sources despite being subject to the biases and limitations of personal memory, and despite Hartmann's interest in portraying himself favorably. Historians use these accounts alongside other sources, including combat reports, Soviet records, and accounts from other participants to construct more complete picture of events. Hartmann's accounts are generally reliable regarding his own experiences, though less reliable regarding broader strategic or political issues where he had limited knowledge or where his interpretations reflected personal biases. The preservation of Hartmann's legacy through aviation museums, historical societies, and veterans organizations ensures that his story remains known even as World War II passes from living memory into history. Museums display his aircraft, his decorations, and artifacts from his career. Historical societies collect documents and testimonies related to his service. Veterans organizations maintain records of JG-52 and of other units he served with. These preservation efforts serve both to honor his achievements and to provide educational resources for studying air combat history and for understanding the human dimensions of warfare. Erich Hartmann's life from 1922 to 1993 spanned Germany's most turbulent century. He grew up in Weimar Republic, came of age during Nazi period, fought in World War II, survived 10 years in Soviet captivity, rebuilt his life in post-war West Germany, served in Cold War military, and lived to see the end of the Cold War and German reunification. His personal journey reflected Germany's journey from defeat to division, to rebuilding to reunification. His ability to adapt to radically changed circumstances while maintaining core sense of identity illustrated human resilience and capacity for navigating historical transformations that sweep away familiar worlds and create new ones. The final assessment of Erich Hartmann must acknowledge both his extraordinary achievements and the problematic context in which they occurred. He was the most successful fighter pilot in history, a testament to skill, dedication, and tactical brilliance. He survived 10 years of harsh Soviet captivity without compromising his principles, demonstrating moral courage and physical resilience. He contributed to rebuilding German Air Force in post-war democratic context, showing capacity for adaptation and continued service. But he also fought for Nazi Germany, contributing to Axis war effort, even if not directly participating in Nazi crimes. His 352 victories represent 352 Soviet pilots killed, some of whom were defending their homeland from invasion. His refusal to express remorse for having served Nazi Germany troubled those who believed that all Germans bear some responsibility for Nazi crimes. These contradictions cannot be resolved into simple judgment. Hartmann was neither pure hero nor villain, but complex individual who lived through extraordinary times and who made choices that were understandable in their context, but that remain morally problematic when examined from later perspective, with knowledge of what Nazi Germany represented. His story illustrates how individual courage and skill can exist alongside moral blindness or moral compromise, how dedicated service can be rendered to unworthy causes, and how history's judgment of individuals must account for both their achievements and the context in which those achievements occurred.